Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. So first of all, welcome to the debate, and thank you to the ATBC for hosting this. I'm really excited about our panel here and the debate, although I'm not sure how much the debate is going to be. I think a lot of people agree on this issue, and I don't know if that would have been the case 10 or 15 years ago at ATBC. I feel like it's changing, but anyway, I'm excited about this. So I'm honored to be joined by four great people here. We have Adriana Sanchez from the University of Rosario. We have Erica Berenger from the University of Oxford. We have, sorry, wrong order. I have Joao Campos Silva from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and I have Robin Chasdon from the University of Sunshine Coast. So thank you all for participating in this. Before we get started with the debate, tomorrow, ATBC is going to be issuing a declaration, and the theme is around environmental defenders. And so the declaration has a bunch of data on the current threats to environmental defenders, and I just wanted to highlight a few of them, from the declaration. So between 2002 and 2017, 1,558 people in 50 countries were killed speaking out in defense of their lands. Indigenous peoples and local communities represented more than a third of the killings, even though they're less than 5% of the world's population. In 2020, 227 people were reportedly killed for defending the environment, and 71% of those deaths were related to defending forests from deforestation and industrial conversion. It was even worse last year. 358 human rights defenders and environmental activists were murdered. Nearly 60% of them were indigenous rights defenders or environmental defenders. Colombia is the world's deadliest country by far over the past 3 years, followed by Mexico and Brazil. But it's not just violence. It also affects scientists directly. So like in Brazil, for example, scientists have been forced out of government roles under the Bolsonaro administration. In Indonesia, scientists are struggling to get permits approved. And in India, journalists and activists are being silenced by the government. And of course, there's a long list of other countries. So this panel is going to discuss how the ATBC community can or should respond to these rising threats. I've organized the questions kind of around three themes. So one is kind of the big picture. The second is risks. And the third is action. So what are some approaches to trying to address this issue that the ATBC community can take? So to kick this off, I'll start off with a question for each of the panelists who wants to respond to this. How long have you been coming to ATBC, and have you noticed any shift in how members view scientists' role in policy and advocacy? So Robin, since you've been very involved with the Conservation Committee, I think I'll start with you on that one.
Tropical biological science to the global public. And that is vital for enhancing the understanding of environmental and conservation values. But if you look at the list of the declarations starting from 2005 on, and also there are some declarations that individual chapters have produced, you will see that they're very much focused on the region where the meetings are taking place, and they focus on important conservation issues of usually protecting particular areas or regions or ecosystems, and not so much focusing on the human part of the problem. There have been some trends, though, toward increasing identification of social and political issues in the declarations. So I think this is a trend that we're seeing, and it's also reflected in the content of the meetings and in the types of talks that participants are bringing. So I do think that the society is recognizing the increasing importance of human, social, and political issues as they intersect with our interest in protecting natural ecosystems and all ecosystems in the tropics.
Great, thanks, Robin. Does anyone else want to respond?
Yes, I think I started to come to ATBC in 2015, so it's hard to say something about trends, but I think that one important aspect is that I think that is increasing the concern to use science to subsidize public policies. And I think that here it's like an agreed topic that science should subsidize public policy and should be available for the population in general.
Thanks. So I'm sure, I mean, this is a big question, but we'll keep it brief. What sorts of threats to biodiversity and environmental defenders are you seeing in the places where you work?
I think that's true that we are seeing, and I can talk only about Brazil, which is the country not only that I come from, but we are at work. And the two main threats that I would say, well, deforestation, but that's nothing new. It's something that has been going on since before I was born, since the 80s it's been going on. And in '88, we had a very high-profile murder of environmental defender. We had Chico Mendes, and we thought that would be a game changer. And just a month ago, we lost Dom and Bruno. Dom, which was reporting about solutions for the Amazon, Dom Phillips, a collaborator of The Guardian, and Bruno Pereira, which was on license from working in the Indigenous People Agency, and he was an environmental defender working with other environmental defenders. So there's two things that led to his death and to the death of Chico Mendes and to these 40 years of span between those two deaths. One is the increased pressure for land, and that's deforestation. Land is an asset. People look for the asset and get rid of whoever is on land. But that can be made easier if there is a federal rhetoric that support the killing of people that stand in the way of land grabbing and deforestation. And that attack on environmental defenders is something that we've been seeing systematically increasing from 2018 to 2022, done by our current president. So I would say that those things go hand in hand because the rhetoric empowers people to act and to be sure that they are not going to be punished, even for murder.
Thanks. Adriana?
I would like to add that, well, first I was surprised to learn that Brazil has as much of an issue with land grabbing as Colombia. I didn't know, and here this is a big issue. And I also think the lack of presence by the government in many of these places, like other presence than just the military, having schools and health points and well, this, like the state's presence. Also, it's also like there is no way of systematically understanding the threats that people are suffering in the field. So it's the lack of government presence, for me, is part of the cause of a lot of these threats and killings.
I think I will, my perspective is much more focused on Brazilian Amazonia, but of course we are living under the Bolsonaro agenda. So I cannot imagine it a worse scenario to think in biodiversity, social rights, and you know, and sustainability. But I would like to point out two big changes that we have been perceiving over the last 4 years in Brazil. One is the arrival of drug trafficking in the Amazonia, Brazilian Amazonia, especially in some specific routes that was not seen like years ago, and this is very, very concerning because the drug trafficking is aligned with other illegal activities, and the risk for local people and also for conservationists has been increasing a lot over the last years. And other thing that is a direct result from Bolsonaro agenda is an increasing of the legitimacy of illegal criminals. So basically they, I think they feel much more empowered at this moment in Brazil. And so it's much easier for them to kill environmentalism, for example, because the impunity in Brazil is very high at this moment. So this is very, very hot topic in Brazil, I think.
Robin, did you want to respond to that? Or? Okay. So question for the group here. Have you, your teams, or your colleagues been threatened directly in the field? Looks like that's a strong consensus there. So I wanted to kind of move into the next section then. So this is about risk. So obviously many scientists come from a point of privilege in that they can go out to the field and then leave. But you have many partners who are who live in the community or live in the forest who do not have that privilege. So how do you or your institution manage that kind of risk?
I think that's a very interesting question, especially being based on an institution in the Global North. The institution has no idea what goes on the ground. It's more concerned about not being sued than with the true safety of those on the ground. It's very hypocritical. And it's not a privilege of my university. I think most universities are like that in the Global North. And as a Brazilian, I would say that institutions in the South Seas also don't understand what goes on in the Amazon. Brazilians from the South Seas cut off and don't understand what goes on in the Amazon. So it turns out that the burden stays with the researchers, and we don't have risk training. We don't have the skills to deal with risks, like, for example, having to talk with paid killers, having to deal with gunmen that come and threaten you, and we learn that on the job. There's no alternative. So I think on mitigating those risks, the most important thing, right, that I would say is that for those of us that have the privilege of living, like I spend 6 months and then I leave and go back to the UK, is to always ask what make others safe. Because I'm going to leave. So what those that stay say that will make them safer. And that might be not posting their photos on social media. That might not be amplifying their voices. My role to keep them safe is to hear. And I think that's really important for those of us based on the Global South, is to hear those that are based on the Global South. Oh, sorry, those of us that are based on the Global North, hear those that are based on the Global South, to hear what they want, what makes people safer, because they are the ones that are left with the threats. And nowadays, we have WhatsApp. As soon as you get to the field, people know that you are in town. People communicate. But those people, they are never going to leave. So we have to look after them, especially because we are privileged, we can leave. So I think hearing is the most important thing that we can do.
Yes, in terms to manage the risk, I think there are some strategies that is very well known in the front line for local leaders and local teams that working in place with a high incidence of violence, which is like, do not travel at night or these kind of things. But I think that I think a good strategy is to not soften or minimize the whole of the state in the safety of people, because we are handle a very strongly armed group of peoples. Like in Brazil at this moment, we have, sometimes you are working at the front line and there are very fast boats with lots of people heavily armed. So cannot face this at local level. So we need a stronger support from the government. So it's very important to put the responsibility of the government at the spotlight, I think.
I was just thinking about all the times I've been in risky places and I've come back alive, nothing has happened to me, you know, and when I travel with students, I tend to be more conservative, so we don't go to very risky places, and you keep asking and all that strategy of like being sure that you're going to a safe place or as safe as possible place. But I was thinking about maybe all the times that you end up exposing communities or people just because you went there, and which happens. And I know it's not necessarily my case, but I know of many colleagues that go to the field and they're in contact with leaders, with people that are threatened in the field, and just the fact that they're going there sort of exposes other people that are in the field. And that's something, it's hard because we want to do our research and we want the data and we want to be able to visit communities and understand what's going on, but at the same time, we have to make sure that our presence is not an issue for the people that are in the field. And I think sometimes as scientists, we want the data so much and we want to understand what's going on that we don't think enough about these things. That are doing, exposing the people in the field that are really threatened and that could literally be killed.
Robin?
I would say that we really have become much more aware of how allied are the interests of conservation biologists and forest ecologists with indigenous peoples, and that before I think that wasn't so much on the forefront how allied our views, our values are and need to be. And we are in a privileged position, as Rhett said, to help to bring these issues out in our work without pointing fingers and without creating more vulnerability. But getting these issues out there is something we can do in ways that might help to have this information reaching a broader set of people and coming from a group of scientists, for example. It sounds differently than coming from some other types of groups who might not have the same kind of credibility. So I think the press, for example, will perhaps pay more attention to something that scientists are saying, so we can really use our privilege to advance some of these issues.
So following up on that, does being an advocate or advocating for some outcome, either individually or collectively, does that compromise perception of scientists' integrity or objectivity?
I think if you make it clear that the underlying issues are of central importance for scientists as well, that I think there's no conflict there. I really think seeing some of these issues through the lens of environmental defenders helps us to do better science, and it doesn't mean that we have to go out and campaign for them directly, but to have that issue become more acceptable for the public to understand, I think that's a big step in that direction.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I was thinking about, I don't collaborate directly with people, but I've had many meetings with, well, more of symposia type, of colloquium type settings with, more campesinos. And it feels like they want their voices to be heard, and they're trying to team up with other people, other instances, institutions that can help them like raise their voice. And I was thinking that even if for them was a risk to travel to Bogota and meet up with us, and they were exposing themselves, and that brought risks to them. They had like security profiles and all these things going on, but just the fact that they really need to raise their voices and team up with people that can help raise their voices so they can be heard. And they were willing to risk their lives. So I thought that was interesting, and like, how do we get involved in this, right? Like to try to, even if they're risking themselves, and sometimes we're risking them by going to their places, but at the same time, they need to be heard, and how we can sum up to that.
Nope. So, I mean, scientists typically aren't considered environmental defenders, but it seems like in some places scientists do face risks if they speak out. So have any of you encountered that, or what are kind of the risks that you see if you're speaking out against government or business interests?
No. Sorry, actually, I didn't understand. Could you repeat?
Yeah. That's why I'm reading the questions.
Yeah, very well.
So what are the risks to scientists?
Yeah, what are the risks to scientists speaking out?
Oh, do you want to say something?
Okay. So recently in Brazil, we saw two different types of risks. In 2019, it was the first year of the Bolsonaro government. Deforestation rates in Amazon were going up. And Bolsonaro said that that was fake news, despite the data. The data is produced by the Spatial Agency of Brazil, INPE, and the president at the time, Ricardo Galvão, spoke out. He's a scientist, he's a physicist. He spoke and said, well, that's just the data, and if you want more information, I can show you. He got fired 2 days later, and so that's one of the instances where scientists were put at risk on their careers because of speaking out, in that case, because deforestation. The Amazon is the biggest thing on Brazil's image to the exterior world, to the rest of the world. So the moment that we're saying, well, deforestation is going up, that has a huge impact in our international image and was against the government interests at the time. So that was one case that was highly publicized, but we had others. I am in particular in one of those cases that I'm a co-author in a paper, was led by Joss Barlow in 2020 in Global Change Biology, which co-authors actually asked not to be part of the paper because they didn't felt secure talking about deforestation and fires in Amazonia because of the current government. So we are being silenced also as scientists, even though it wasn't an opinion paper or policy forum, it was a data-driven paper. And that's quite scary because the moments that you are silencing science, well, what you're then producing for your country, there's no progress without science, isn't it?
Yes, and in this context, I think it's very important the role of associations like ATBC, because you can promote, you can do advocacy, but in name of groups of researchers. So you can, you know, the advocacy is not personified. Is it? This palavra exists? Yeah? Yeah. I think it's important, for example, this kind of declarations and these strategies of, to promote advocacy. So it's not in name of researchers, but a very large group of researchers.
Well, yeah, here I've heard this same situation as in Brazil, where people rather not put their name or just not put their institution because they can get kicked out of their institution if they expose themselves not as individuals but as part of an institution when they're commenting on issues related to deforestation or whatever that is governmental. So yeah, I feel like here we have the same issue, like our voices are, yeah, as scientists, we also, there's a pressure or there's an underlying threat in which you can get kicked out of your job if you say the wrong things.
Can I comment that? Your answer just reminded me of something, which is the landscape of fear that is created, isn't it? Because the moment that our colleagues are stepping out of papers, that completely changes the way that we do our own science. The questions that we ask are changed. So we might still be publishing, but you're publishing on something slightly different. And that's also a form of silencing scientists. So it's not because you're still publishing or still doing science that you're not being silenced. And I think that's really important to be addressed.
I mean, so this is kind of related, but it's not really an environmental defenders issue, but there are companies and governments that are engaged in certain activities that put environmental defenders at threat. But they also fund scientific research. And so do you ever have to navigate that as a scientist where, I mean, it may be funding, it may be you're getting rides on trucks or helicopters. Like, how is that for you? And I mean, how do you navigate that situation? No?
There was a interesting story one time, a big company in Brazil, they offered a very good amount of money for our organization, but they are strongly connected with deforestation in Amazonia. So it was a hard decision, but we decided to not accept it. But then, few months later, they sent a big amount of money for a grassroots organization, which works in the same territory. And then we have like a conversation with our organizations working there, and a local leader said, well, we are suffering for a long time here in the territory. So this big amount of money arrives, and they do not, there's no interference in our planning, in our goals. So we decided to accept, to conduct our work. And so it will depend from where you are talking about. I think in our case, was much more complicated to receive this money, but I think that if this funding goes directly to grassroots, to local organizations that are doing conservation and biodiversity value chains at the front line, I think I think it's not a problem in my opinion.
All right, we've talked a lot about problems, so maybe we can talk about some solutions here. So if a scientist wants to speak out on an issue, either individually or as, collectively, what venues or channels do you find to be effective to do that?
I think what is most effective is if we speak with unified voices as an organization, because that carries a lot more weight. It's more of a consensus, and it should be taken more seriously. Not that individual points shouldn't be taken seriously, but it's another step to convince a whole organization to make a statement and to advocate on behalf of a certain cause. And I think this is a fundamental role of professional societies today, and one that the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation takes seriously. So I think there are ways of doing that in journals and in the media and in all kinds of communications that we have with journalists that can be very effective ways of getting that word out to the general public.
Well, I was just thinking about how, I don't know if that word, impunity is a word in English, that many of these killings just go sort of, yeah, they're reported here in Colombia. We have some NGOs that tell us who gets killed and where and what type of defender. But like, I wonder what happens with those data, what happens afterwards. If it's just another, sorry to say this, is another name in a list, which is horrible, but what happens with those people who did the killing? Like, that's why I go back to the institutions, is the lack of strength in the institution to really protect the lives of those who are speaking out about these issues. And yeah, I think as academics we can join and be a community and talk about these things, but I also think about the government and what they're supposed to do, right, to protect the right to live. which is not being protected and is the most basic right that we have. And so this lack of institutions and the lack of presence of the government and the lack of like a strong government that we respect and recognize, for me, is also part of the issue. A very important part of the issue, I would say.
So, I mean, this kind of builds on this a little bit, but what actions can scientists take that effectively impose the greatest penalties or costs on bad actors who are defending the, who are going after environmental defenders? Because if the government isn't doing it, then, like, what do you do, basically? Yeah.
This is a very hard question, actually, but I don't know as a scientist, but I think we need we need in those places, we need stronger governance and public safety followed by a low impunity. I think that is very important. It's not on the scientist's hand, but maybe we can help to put it at the spotlights. And I think that other things that are important is to deeper understand the drivers of this violence, because it is related with a very complex mechanism related to illegal use of natural resources. So if us as scientists can elucidate how this works, maybe we can help not only to divulgate this case and put at the spotlight, but also to subsidize some boycotts, for example. We have a recent paper on science where the authors, Raoni Rajão and collaborators, showed that 20% of the soybean and 17% of the beef exported to Europe can be linked with illegal deforestation. So all the illegal activities, for example, in Amazonia, are going for some place. Who is behind these illegal activities? So I think this is a very important question that should be addressed for science, and because I don't believe that although it is concentrated in Amazonia, this is not a local problem. It's a global phenomenon that links many countries. And sometimes it's like a colonialist relation where many natural resources are going far away from Brazil. So we need to describe it. We need to understand these supply chains to take better actions. So I think in this issue, the science can help a lot.
I think building on what you just said, Joao, is exposing, right, with data, what we know. And I think it's exposing in papers that we write, but also through media like Mongoe or newsletters, newspapers. Or, I was thinking too that there are many people that work very closely with communities, and we can, I think that maybe there's a momentum if a community is already very strong. I would like to think that we can surpass, it's already so recognized, and so that maybe it's less likely to be as threatened, maybe maybe I'm just being too hopeful or naive, like that if we keep working very closely, the people, the scientists that work closely with communities, empowering, like doing more governability, maybe there's a critical point that you can go past, and maybe it's less likely to suffer as much violence. I don't know, maybe some of you already have better data than I do. I'm just thinking about these things, and how can we sort of cross the boundary in which people are more vulnerable in their communities, and sort of like to bring them to a place where there's so much in the spotlight that they're less likely to be killed or be at risk. I don't know if there's data in that, probably, but people. I hope something like that could work. And as scientists, the people that work in those fields can sort of help push them to that point.
So you mentioned data, and we now live in a world of misinformation. And so data sometimes only goes so far. And as a journalist, it's very frustrating because you have people who just don't make decisions or based off data, or they lack the ability to discern what's real and what's not real. So how do you as scientists navigate that issue of fake news or misinformation? Because it's directly undercutting your work. I mean, are there strategies you have to, do you need to partner with activists, or what does this look like?
Because of the feedback.
They're like the source of data. It's hard to get reliable data. We just sort of get whatever we can get from institutional, non-institutional NGOs or institutional data. So for some papers, we've been like trying to get data that is publicly available, but yeah, a lot of it's like not all of the information is out there. Some may be manipulated. It's the era of misinformation. So I think we're doing the best we can with the data that is available, which it has problems, but at least using those data to try to show a problem and expose a problem with as the best data we can possibly get, or at least as much data as we can possibly get to show with numbers or show with figures or trends or whatever we're using and expose the problem as best as we can, because I agree, it's terrible. It's very hard to overcome this problem.
So how to navigate as scientists in an age of misinformation? So my understanding of that question is when we actually, it's not about what we do in the peer review process, it's after it. It's when that paper becomes information to the wider audience. So one thing that for the past 3 years I found very helpful is actually talking about the evidence. The evidence points out, the evidence says, it's not about our opinion. I think that feeds into misinformation when we personalize, which was what you were talking about, because it's not about us. It's about what the data shows. And I think that's really important because it's really easy to suffer from ad hominem fallacy. So to, how do you say, to attack the messenger? Yeah, to attack the messenger rather than the message, right? So if we take the focus out of us, despite us being authorities in our fields, but if we put the focus on the data, which is where it should be, it shouldn't be on us, the focus should be on the message, I think that's a way to try to navigate better misinformation. That's something that I actually find quite helpful, and a way to actually talk to people that have completely different political opinions, but it's not about my opinion, it's not about if I think that spinach is good or bad, it's about what the data shows, and then that's something that often I thought they could unify fields. I thought that was quite interesting this past 3 years of the Bolsonaro government, quite clearly. That's what I'm talking about.
I mean, I do think that international bodies have a big role here, and they have been, like the IPCC and now the IPBES, coming out with these very well-documented studies that have representation from countries all over the world. I think these are ways of fighting back against disinformation and also supporting the kind of detailed evidence-based work that scientists do, but making them relevant and providing this information to the general public and making key messages and expressing it in a way that non-scientists can understand. So there's certainly a need to do more of that, but I think that these international bodies, including other UN organizations, really do have an important role to play here. Of course, if you don't want to listen to those organizations, then you can listen to the disinformation instead. So there's always the option of rejecting that. But I think the message of the IPCC is coming through now after 20 years of repeated. And they're not backing down, they're not changing the story, that's consistent. And I think that's what the people rely on for scientists.
Technical thing. So I have a few more questions, but we do want to take questions from the audience, and we save some time for that. So I would say if people want to start lining up or prepare or thinking about what questions they want to ask, start that now. Just recently, the Escazú agreement was ratified officially. So this is a mechanism that's in place to help protect land defenders. Should an organization like ATBC or the panelists-owned organizations and institutions consider endorsing that or supporting it?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Escazú was the first agreement that included the rights of environmental defender, and it can be adopted by several countries. So it's, I think, a global strategy. So it's very important, in my opinion. Brazil has signed it in 2018, but of course, completely ignored after the Bolsonaro election. But I think that would be super nice to support this document because it is like a strategy to think in a much higher scale.
I do think that's the kind of initiative that ATBC should support. And you know, there are other types of international declarations like that that really should be viewed as opportunities for ATBC to represent the interests of the tropical biologists they represent.
So the declaration is going to come out tomorrow. It's being worked on right now. What would be the top one thing for each of you that you'd like to see in the ATBC declaration on environmental defenders? Who wants to go first?
I think for me, one of the messages that is key is that our voices shouldn't be silenced. There are many ways of being violent, and there are many ways of, like violence can show up in many different ways. So I think like defendants like these environmental defenders shouldn't be silenced. Our voices shouldn't be silenced or threatened in academia, or journalists shouldn't be threatened for talking about these things. So for me, that's a very important point, that we need to have discussions. We may not agree, but that doesn't mean that just because we don't agree, our voices should be silenced.
Yeah. I think that there are two main strategies that I think is important. One is to increase the local government's capacity. I think that the territorial empowerment of indigenous people and local communities are very, very important because our empowered communities are relatively safer. But in the other direction, I think it's very important to pressure the government to increase the oversight over the territories by using new monitoring technologies and increasing the human resource. I think that these two combined actions would be very, very important, at least in the case of Brazilian Amazonia.
Robin?
Well, I think that we should publicly declare how important it is for government leaders to protect all of the peoples that live in the country and to represent the whole spectrum of different peoples that live there and improve their, and be on the right side of human rights.
If we are in any way to stay below 2 degrees Celsius increase from industrial times, which we know the 1.5, it's long gone. If we are to stay below the 2 degrees, we must protect environmental defenders. They are the only way that we can keep humanity function as it is, avoiding a tipping point of the Amazon, for example, is to keep the forest standing, and those are the people fighting for it. And we need to recognize their role. And this is vital, because the moment that you put the protagonism on those people that are on the front line, not defending the forest and their livelihoods, but defending humanity, when we shift our views on how we see those people, it's when we can pressure the rest of society to also change their views and to protect those that are actually protecting us. And that's what I would like to see in the declaration.
Great, thank you. So we'll open up to the floor for questions.
Hi, my name is Fernanda. I'm from Brazil, and I'm currently working in the Amazon. And from my point of view, all these conflicts and violence happens because all these products, illegal mining, deforestation, illegal logging, etc., exist because there's a market, right? And as João said, all these products, they don't stay in Brazil. They are sold in Europe and North America. So if people continue to buy gold and diamond and wood from tropical countries, we're going to still have this kind of conflict and a lot of violence, right? So it's more a comment, because I think it's a little bit injustice when we talk about all these illegal activities, we think about that individual that does the activity. But that individual is just there because he needs to make a living, right? He needs to buy his dinner and feed his family. But so now I think we should share more responsibility, right? In the past, all these rich countries, they were stealing resources from our countries, but now they are paying. They pay because it's cheaper. And it's cheap because the chain process, part of the chain process is illegal. That's it. There's no secret.
Can I comment? Yeah. Fernanda, I totally agree. I think that you bring an important point, because those people at the front line, they need other alternatives. And this is very related to us, because sometimes conservation, for conservationists and many researchers, conservation is something at the end, something that you need to achieve, is a project outcome, a project output. But actually, for those people, conservation should be a way of life, should be an alternative to improve their lives and protect the forest at the same moment. So in places where we have illegal activities, but we have an alternative, a sustainable alternative in terms of biodiversity value chains, those people prefer stay in legal activities. So it is very important that the conservation sites help to improve this arrangement, this model that can align biodiversity protection and social aspiration and social needs.
I like what you said about shared responsibility, co-responsibility, because coming from a country that has been stigmatized for so long for the illegal drug trade, while we don't consume it here, at least not the vast majority of it, is very difficult, right? Because we get the bulk of, like, you are the producers, and here inside the country is to the farmers, right? To the campesinos. You are the culprit, right? So we're all the time sort of pointing fingers and telling, you did it, no, you did it, you did it, you did it. And we go to the sort of to the poorest, more vulnerable people and say, you're the culprit. And many of these people don't really have many more choices. It's like making a living, but most of them are at the point of gun, right? You have to do this, or their lives are at risk if they don't do it. It's a very complicated issue, but I think we can't keep pointing fingers and trying to find the culprit that is the most vulnerable, and that we can keep pointing that finger to that culprit. So we're like, oh, we're trying, you know? So we just go and put a bunch of glyphosate and say, oh, we're doing something. So showing to the other countries, oh, we're doing something about illegal trade of cocaine, for example. So we just go pour a bunch of glyphosate, super toxic, and leave those communities even worse than they were. So with toxicity, with all these issues. So yeah, I think there is a matter of like co-responsibility, that like the countries that are, for instance, consuming our goods, that most of them are illegal, have to recognize that they're doing it. And so we have to find a way to share that responsibility and not keep pointing fingers. And yeah, maybe legalizing would be a solution for us, something that needs to be studied under many different points of view. But like, we need to find a better way to deal with this because it's not working, at least in the case of the drug trade in Colombia.
So I'll step out of line here a little bit. I think, you know, in terms of like what ATBC can do, I mean, a lot of scientists here are quantifying those connections between consuming countries and the commodities in the countries where they're produced. The other thing that countries, or the scientists can do in you know, like global north or consuming countries is put pressure on politicians. Because like, for example, in the United States, you know, there's zero prospects that the US is going to do anything on climate, you know, given the political situation. And it's, you know, very frustrating. But so for that reason, like, you know, scientists in places like the United States really need to step up. Next question.
Yeah, I think it's more a comment. He's Marielos Peñaclaros from Bolivia, but working in the Netherlands. I think one option to share responsibilities is to look at where our fund, our money for our retirement fees are going. And I wonder how many of you actually know where the retirement funds that you are giving, you know, being as an ecologist, I wonder how many of you actually know where those funds are being invested. Thanks to a publication from Mongabay, it turned out to be that the main retirement fund company in the Netherlands is actually part of investing a lot of money on fossil fuels, is also investing on deforestation-related activities, so investing on companies that actually are very well known for not doing right things. So I think that we as scientists can take those chances to really put pressure to bring changes. So something that we did was to write a letter asking our university to take action on that regard, because we as researchers working on environmental issues didn't want to have our funds, our retirement fees being invested on deforestation. Can you imagine? I mean, I'm working to save the Amazon forest, and my money is actually going towards cattle ranching on companies that are known to be doing wrong things. That created a lot of movement, and actually I think the attitude that we need to have as scientists is to really have an open discussion with these companies, with the governments, and not come up with pointing fingers there, but actually saying, okay, this is the data showing what you can do, and try to help, you know, these funds and other companies to come up with better ways to organize their things. And in that sense, I think that will be a way of sharing our responsibilities, but working in our place where we are working. I think that's something that we can do and have a large impact. At least that's my illusion.
So I think we have time for one more question, maybe two.
Yes, this is Mauricio Diaz-Granados from Colombia. I think we from science, we are failing in two big things. Number one, we should be influencing more in politics. And number two, we should be disseminating and engaging society more. The facts that we are still choosing presidents, leaders of countries that don't believe in climate change is our fault. And the facts that half of the societies in some countries are still choosing leaders that don't believe in the importance of environment is because we are not doing the job good enough. So perhaps it's because we just publish our papers and we are not concerned in disseminating this knowledge and engaging society, because everybody should be totally convinced about the importance of protection of these environments for our survival. So this is probably a couple of points that could be added. We should be influencing more in politics, and we should be engaging more society. Thank you.
My name is Paulo Negret, and we had a symposium earlier on the week about armed conflict and deforestation. And we had some really interesting ideas that we talked about. But I want to go more to a personal thing that happened when I was doing my master thesis. I spent 1 year in the Amazon foothill in Colombia in the Caquetá department. And I was focused on my research, and I had a really close relation with the people I was living with. And they told me so many stories, and I got to understand really well how they interacted with nature and with these illegal armed groups and with all these things. And I remember that in that moment I thought to myself, I should be recording this in a journal or on something. And when I talked to them, they were willing to share their way of understanding all these conflicts and things. Of course, probably not at a personal level, like with their names. So what I think is that it sometimes we're focused too much on our science, and we also can get a lot of knowledge that we can gather, and then we can use posteriorly in multiple ways that can help them. And there's a really nice and that touched me example from an indigenous leader in Australia that did a PhD, and she used spatial analysis to map all the murders of indigenous leaders by the English in the colonization. And not only mapping as we might think like, oh, data, where are these people happen, but also because she was indigenous. She had the knowledge to give it an extra level of knowledge. And I think that, I think that those kind of things can be done, and we probably have to use our knowledge to give voice to these people with the tools that we have. And that's my comment.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions. I think we're out of time. So I just want to thank our panel here and ATBC for hosting this, and hopefully people found it interesting. So thank you again.